Thank you for joining Nikkei Forum. My name is Sonoko Watanabe, Deputy Publisher of Nikkei Asia, Senior Executive Officer of Nikkei. For those who may not hear about Nikkei, Nikkei is a global media organization headquartered in Tokyo. The Untold Story of Chip War is the first session of the new series of forum Nikkei is going to host. The forum focusing on the ongoing global competition for the control of advanced chip technology. As title, the estimated impact of the US export control suggests, today we are going to explore what we need to know about the changing landscape of chip war. So today we have three distinguished panelists, Mr. Chris Miller, author of the global bestseller, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. The Financial Times, our Nikkei Group publication, selected the book as the Business Book of the Year 2022, and two Nikkei Asia journalists based in Taiwan who cover aggressively semiconductor industry and all related to the tech supply chain, Miss Ting-Fang and Miss Lauly. Nikkei Asia is our flagship indie publication, and Annie and Lauly's coverage has been awarded not only in Asia, but also in the United States. And today, we have already received hundreds of questions and expect more. So we will try to incorporate your questions into our discussion. Okay, so let's start. So the first question is to Chris. Good evening. Chris is joining from Boston, United States. So your book, Chip War, was published last fall. So today we'd like to discuss the developments taking place after the publication. So first, could you explain what do you think the important development since the publication?
Well, I think there are three big events that have happened since I published the book. First is that there's been a major acceleration in government's efforts in multiple different countries to put money into their own chip industries. You see this in the US, which funded the CHIPS Act last year and is about to start handing out funds to semiconductor companies. We also see it in Europe, which has finalized its own CHIPS Act in recent months. And then countries like Japan and India are also continuing to roll out their semiconductor subsidy programs. So there's been in every major country that has a chip industry or wants to have one, an expansion and further development of semiconductor subsidies. That's the first key trend. The second is that the trend of controls and retaliation against controls has only accelerated. Most notably last October, actually right after I published my book, with the October 7th controls released by the United States on the export of GPUs and some manufacturing equipment to China. But since then, the decision by Japan and the Netherlands to join on those export controls, and we've seen retaliation from China in several different forms since then, most recently with the restrictions on gallium and germanium exports. So that's the second trend, this accelerating tit for tat. And the third important trend is that there's been a new wave of interest in the use of semiconductors for artificial intelligence. And this is something that in the industry people have been focused on for some time, but I think it first hit the public view when ChatGPT was released earlier this year. And as everyone realized that not just ChatGPT, but many of the world's leading AI systems are trained on NVIDIA chips. And if you just look at NVIDIA's share price over the past couple of months, you'll see an extraordinary rise driven by that interest. So those are the key three trends that have changed and accelerated since I published the book.
Yeah, thank you for Chris pointing out those three big important components. So we will come back to those later. But before that, like now, I'd like to ask our same question to everyone. So as Chris said, there are a lot of developments. So do you think the industry players that correctly understand the impact of the various measures taken by the various governments around the world, particularly the Washington? So please answer yes or no, and why you think so. Please answer very briefly. So starting from Chris.
Well, I think industry is constantly trying to catch up to the decisions that governments are taking. Not only the U.S. government, but also the Chinese government and other governments. The past couple of years have seen a lot of political changes, a lot of regulatory changes, and it's been hard for the industry to understand what all of these mean.
How about Annie?
My answer will also be no. It's very challenging, especially for Asia suppliers, to deal with export controls. Many of them really did not handle geopolitics before a Huawei crackdown. One thing that constantly brought up in the industry is the US chip developer Qualcomm is still able to legally supply to Huawei on 4G mobile chipsets, but Qualcomm's Asia rival MediaTek got no licenses on 4G mobile chips, but only some peripheral chips for Huawei. So actually, there are no clear guidance of what can be approved and what cannot. So that's something that caught industry in between. And also export control rules are complicated and constantly changing.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. So how about Lauly?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sonoko-san. I think the answer is really yes and no, because over the years of the US-China tension, the industry kind of recognized that the new normal of the supply chain is full of geopolitical uncertainties, and the dynamic is so unpredictable. So every time a new export control is being announced, it will take time to digest the details, back and forth consulting with the officials, trade lawyers, and nonstop internal, external meetings before they could really form a comprehensive understanding of the new rules. And so, although they understand the significance of the new export controls, I doubt any suppliers, regardless their sector in the supply chain, could confidently say they 100% understand the new rules and can always make the right responses and actions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lauly. Yeah, our partners think that industry players try to understand and try to catch up, but they needed to more. Yeah, they need to do more. They need to understand more. So next question is something about the question to the historian. Yeah, Chris, yeah, it's you. So we've seen the semiconductor conflicts in past, such as dispute took place in 1980s between Washington and Tokyo. So do you think the current measures taken by the United States government is nothing comparable to the approach taken in the past? And if so, why? Yeah, how do you think?
Well, I think there are some similarities between the U.S.-Japan dispute in the 1980s and early 1990s and U.S.-China tension today, but I think there are more differences than similarities. In the 1980s, the question was really about trade. What were the subsidies that different firms were alleged to be receiving? Were currencies undervalued? And you hear some of these debates as well with regard to the US and China today, but really when you talk to policymakers, they're much less concerned about trade than they are about security.
Right.
And that's why I think the scale of response from the US, from Japan, when it comes to tech transfer to China has been so much more dramatic than what we saw in the 1980s. And I think it's taken industry by surprise because industry, almost all chips that are produced today end up in civilian uses, smartphones, PCs, consumer devices. And so most people in the chip industry didn't think of themselves as producing militarily relevant or strategic goods. And governments have spent the last 5 years trying to convince them that, in fact, they're a strategic industry. And it's taken many in the industry by surprise.
Yeah. Yeah, you also suggested in the book, now like a semiconductor is really regarded some important like national security matters and also the important component of the military. Yeah, I understand. But next question is to Arnie. You reported about the several moves since those announcements. So you reported in January that Dell, a US PC giant, planned to stop using China-made chips by 2024. And this week, you also reported another piece telling that this time the HP is planning to shift the laptop production from China. This is all about like a so-called like de-risking or the China moves. So do you think why they needed to do, and could they really pave the way for sourcing non-China chips? How do you think?
Yes, the China move is actually still ongoing. What we heard recently was Dell's suppliers might need till the end of 2024 to complete the initiative to phase out China-made chips. About made in China chips, we are not referring to CPUs or GPUs made by US tech giants, Intel, AMD, NVIDIA. Those are not in China, but notebook computers need so many different types of chips, including DRAM and NAND flash memories, as well as other components for keyboards, display panels, cameras, and other features. These chips could be produced or packaged still in China, even it's not by Chinese companies. So, and beside chips, Dell is also shifting its final product assembly to non-China locations. According to our supply chain checks, more than 20% of laptop production will be going to Vietnam this year for Dell. And some may ask why Dell is much more serious about de-risking than its American peer, HP. One strong incentive is that Dell controls more than 70% of market share of the US government-related PC. So that's why one of the reasons. But I want to bring up the story this week that HP is for the first time also moving millions of units of laptop production out of China. Locations are in Mexico, Thailand, and the later Vietnam. And actually, why it's significant was because it was a very strong supporter to help China build up its notebook computer ecosystem more than a decade ago. It bet very big on the Chinese western city of Chongqing since 2008. And now Chongqing is still the world's top notebook computer production hub. So HP's diversification move recently, despite its very low key, after years of evaluation, but still it's quite symbolic and underline the impacts of the US-China tension.
How about Lauly? So now, like Arnie pointed out, the why didn't HP they needed to do, but how about other like industrial players, or how about other brands? Like a list of the players in the tech supply chain, like needed to do more or less going to follow the same path, or or then is it inevitable, or is there any other way?
Thank you for the question. But first, I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on the impact of the export control and geopolitics on the supply chain. Because the tech supply chain is really long and complicated, especially the semiconductor supply chain that could involve from chip design tools, chip designers, chip making equipment, chemicals, gas, to chip makers, and not to mention countless number of key components in the manufacturing process. So when we talk about the scope of the export control impact, it will be much broader than a specific targeted sector and could have a chain reaction to the industry. And so, for example, we see the US memory chip making giant Micron was all of a sudden being probed by the Chinese government earlier this year over the concerns of national security of its products. The move by the Chinese government is widely seen as a countermeasure against the US, as the timing of the announcement came after Washington sealed an agreement with the Netherlands and Japan to also restrict their exports of the chip-making tools for advanced chips. So the sentiment of the deteriorating geopolitics is certainly have a longer and wider impact for the entire supply chain beyond the chip industry. And that's why we are seeing tech companies, especially American companies, like what Annie said about Dell and HP, are reducing their manufacturing presence in China and increase their footprints in Southeast Asia. So other than Dell and HP, like Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, also told their suppliers to build a new cluster outside of China. We're seeing major contract electronics makers like Foxconn or Pegatron or Quanta Computers are helping their US clients to build significant capacity in Southeast Asia or Vietnam and Thailand under the request of their clients. And this mega trend of regional manufacturing, spurred by the tech industry's desire to de-risk the geopolitical uncertainties, is going to stay for a long time.
Okay, so but how about I believe maybe the Annie, so you regularly contact with like a trade lawyers, not only in Asia, but also probably in Washington. And so who are working for the Asian companies. So considering happening those kind of new developments, what kind of questions are frequently asked to those lawyers, and what kind of advices they offer to their clients?
Yes, in fact, many Asia suppliers are hoping to know if there are clear guidelines of who gets what licenses and if it is worth spending time applying for licenses for some products, and also how to apply. I spoke to Washington-based lawyers. This part sometimes is difficult because the Commerce Department never made public which company gets what licenses and the amount. We know some status only because that company disclosed itself. And also a point that a very experienced trade lawyer once told me that the US even have some internal scores to rate the trustworthiness of different companies. If US government are not very familiar with your company, then it's possible that it could be more difficult to get a similar licenses compared with the companies they know very well. I'm told that even different American companies have different ranking of trustworthiness. So that means you need to constantly really engage with them. Also, I do notice some Asia small and medium-sized companies adopt a method that they just kept it extremely low key and hope they stay under the radar. However, US lawyers advise such an approach could be very, very risky and could put those companies in huge legal uncertainties. Violation of the rules could end up in $1 million of fines and criminal charges. So their advice are, if you are not sure, it's better to pause the business and evaluate instead of continue shipping, later realize, oh, the move could be violating the rules.
Sorry, may I just add one point to what Annie just said?
Yes.
Because because one time I talked to a trade lawyer who is based in London, and he shared with me that actually the export control, the trade lawyers business have never been so good before. I mean, the request is like flooding coming over from the world, and because today is a export control about US and China, and tomorrow is the sanction about Russia. So they are really, really, really busy. And sometimes one of the advices that they will give to their clients is, if you think your products might need to apply for a license, you might need to wait for 24 months to get your license approved, passed. So if you have the time to wait, then wait. But if you don't have the time cost to wait, then just forget about it. Don't ship. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you, Anya and Lauly. How about some related question? Maybe something to Chris. Because also you talked to a lot of people in the United States, and I think a lot of people ask you about this issue. And also you recently in Japan, and also you are in Taiwan. So I think a lot of people want to ask a lot of questions, in particular those U.S. government measures. So what is their concern, and what you listened more? How about that?
I think if you talk to US government officials, they're fixated on the question of access to semiconductors that are used in AI training. And that's why, if you look at the October 7th controls last year, the only type of chips that were controlled were chips used in training AI systems. And they were fixated on that. And this was, again, before ChatGPT was released. And this was I think they were focused on even before the public generally was, but they were focused on that because they believed and still believe that these types of large language models will be important, not just for commercial uses, but also for government uses, for defense and intelligence uses. And so if the logic of the export controls is to limit China's access to chips used for AI training and the tools that you could use to produce the chips used for AI training, the challenge is that, of course, the same chips that could train military systems can also train and are used to train civilian systems. There's really no way of differentiating them. And on top of that, the challenge is that the tools used to produce these types of chips are also used to produce almost all other types of chips as well. There's no way of telling a lithography machine or a deposition machine you can only produce civilian chips. Once they're in the hands of a fab, you can make whatever type of chip you want. And so the US, along with Japan and the Netherlands, now has imposed very broad restrictions trying to limit these military and security use cases, but in the process has had a major impact on commercial chip making as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Actually, we got a lot of questions about like a future of the U.S. Semiconductor sector. And yeah, in addition to the export control, as you suggested, that there are other U.S. measures, including like CHIPS and the Service Act. And but do you think like those new policies will give like enough support for the U.S. semiconductor sectors? Yeah, we have our question from the U.S. audience asking like, can Intel, AMD, or any other U.S. chip manufacturers catch up to TSMC's technology? How do you think?
Well, I think if you look at the race to develop the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing technology, there's really only three companies in that race if you're looking at processor chips. There's TSMC, which is the biggest and most advanced player today, the biggest by far. And then there's Samsung and Intel behind them. And you know, it's impossible to predict with any certainty which of those companies is going to be ahead in the race in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time. I think if you look at the industry, most people expect TSMC to retain its absolutely critical role at the center of the industry fabricating logic chips. And if you look at the US government and the way the CHIPS Act is likely to be implemented, and of course, they still haven't actually given out any incentive funds yet. They're going to start doing that later this year or next year. But the US government, it appears, is going to also bet on TSMC and Samsung and Intel simultaneously, because all three of those companies are likely, I suspect, to get funds from the CHIPS Act. And so I think that the US government is sort of implicitly saying, we're not sure which company is going to have the best technology, but we'd rather make 3 bets and hope that one of them pays off rather than just make 1 bet and have it be the wrong bet. I think if you ask the question, is the CHIPS Act succeeding? You know, you've certainly seen a major increase in investment in semiconductor manufacturing facilities in the US over the past year, just a huge increase. But that's actually not surprising. It's not surprising that when you pay companies to build factories, they'll build factories. That's obvious. The real question is, after the CHIPS Act money is spent, are there additional rounds of investment made by companies for their own commercial interests? And that's where there's a lot more uncertainty about whether countries will see it in their commercial interest to keep investing in the US, or to have there's one factory that the CHIPS Act funded and then return to investing in other geographies. Right now, it's too soon to tell.
Yeah, it's also there's some question related to the like CHIPS and Service Act. It's to Lauly. Actually, yeah, as Chris said, the act like encourage the foreign companies, not only the U.S. companies, like foreign companies such as TSMC or Samsung or SK Hynix, to invest in the United States. But on the other hand, the act sets some limits, like for their expansion in China, and everybody has a big operation in China. So what kind of concerns do those like foreign companies have? Are they struggling with some kind of the dilemma?
Yeah, the CHIP Act was announced first, and the details of the terms and conditions were disclosed after. And there are some limits that specifically made the potential applicants like TSMC, Samsung, SK Hynix raise their eyebrows, which is the Chinese investment restriction you mentioned, as all these chip makers have existing manufacturing capacities in China. And the restriction definitely makes the suppliers' long-time strategic and business planning more complex. And let's not forget that these suppliers like Samsung and SK Hynix already have to apply for a license from the US government if they want to import chip making tools for their memory chip manufacturing in China. I remember TSMC chairman Mark Liu, I think it's in June, has said that, although he did not specify, that some of the terms and conditions are hard to accept, and the company is still negotiating with the US government. And when he talked about TSMC's potential investment plans in Germany, he said that, I hope there won't be some conditional support for the subsidies. And that tells you something about what the suppliers think of that. Other than these subsidies restrictions, for a foreign newcomer like TSMC, who mainly expanded capacity in Taiwan for decades and is building its first advanced chip facility in US in 20 years, there are several challenges awaiting. For example, like talent shortage and cultural differences. I attended a forum in Taipei a couple of months ago where the panelists were Chris and TSMC founder Morris Chang. And I'm sure, Chris, you will remember it too. During the event, Morris Chang shared a little story about the work culture in Taiwan. He said in Taiwan, a chip-making engineer may get a call 2 a.m. in the morning to fix an equipment bug in the fab. And the engineer's wife will wake up and ask, what's going on? And the engineer will say, nothing, I have to go to the fab. And the wife won't say anything more, but just go back to sleep again. And that's a very normal life for a chip engineer in Taiwan. And that kind of work culture is very, very difficult to be replicated in places like in the US. So newcomers have to adjust their mindset as well as to adapt to the new environment. And that's not an easy task.
Thank you, Lauly. Yeah, Chris also said like maybe the CHIP Act bring the first batch of the investment in the United States because of the incentive. But the problem is whether they will continue to invest or to get maybe the new investor. So now Lauly suggested some like a talent issue. I believe other country or other economies like Taiwan also are struggling. But from your point of view, what is the biggest challenge for US semiconductor industry that to be developed?
Well, it's interesting to talk about talent issues because on the one hand, I think it's absolutely right that US firms or firms operating in the US face talent issues. But then when I visit firms in Europe or in Taiwan or in Japan and ask executives there what issues they face, they all say they face talent issues too. So it seems like everyone has talent issues that they're facing in their own ways. I think in the US, if you're talking about semiconductor manufacturing, there are a couple of specific challenges. One is cost. It is higher cost to manufacture in the US relative certainly to Taiwan, to Korea, also to China. And the point of the CHIPS Act is to provide subsidies to offset some of that cost differential. I think a second issue is scale. What we've seen over the past several decades, especially in Korea and Taiwan, is the construction of massive scale. And that's important for attracting suppliers to also build at the type of scale that you need. And if you, I think, look at the projects under construction right now in the United States, one of the challenges that companies face is not just building their own project, but then getting all of the suppliers that they need right around them. And in places like Taiwan and Korea, where there's been a lot of investment over the past several decades, those suppliers largely already exist. And so building out not just the fabrication base, but also the chemical suppliers and all the other component suppliers you need, that is a second challenge. And I think those are two challenges that will persist for a long time. They're not insurmountable problems, but they're not easy to solve, and you can't solve them overnight.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, now we are almost halfway of the webinar. So now we would like to take the short break for around 2 minutes. So if you have any questions, please continue to post. So we will incorporate your questions to our discussion. Okay, so let's move to some break. We'll come back after 2 minutes.
Thanks to you, our valued readers, Nikkei Asia has been able to invest further in delivering independent quality journalism from Asia to the world. From award-winning analysis on the US-China tech decoupling, human rights issues, and China's Belt and Road ambitions, to exclusive interviews with the people in power in Asia, and breaking news from all over the region. Our team of over 1,500 journalists and an ever-growing dedicated newsroom will strive to uncover the stories that other publications miss. Nikkei Asia, the voice of the Asian century.
Thank you for coming back. So in the part 2, we will discuss more about the future. So now we just talk about US semiconductor industry. So also a lot of interest is future of the China semiconductor industry, of course. So let's talk about China's move. So the question is to the Annie. Let's talk about China. So China actually took the several countermeasures. So as Chris pointed out, earlier this month, China announced the curve on the export of the several key materials like the germanium and the gallium. Of course, those are famous for the material for the battery for the EVs, but also they are important for the semiconductor. So Annie, what kind of response do you get from your sources like industrial players? And also the another question related to China is, what is actually the current situation of the China's semiconductor industry? We remember during the COVID, you reported the semiconductor factory in Wuhan, still continued its operation. Although everything others is stopping. But actually, what is happening now?
Sure, yes. I think about the China export curbs of key materials on germanium and gallium, like the industry is still digesting what is the implication because the supply chain is long and complex. And actually, it will affect the substrate suppliers which buy raw materials from China. So the industry still have inventories, but we see that some people start panic buying some substrate, but still there's no like real effect, right? Like maybe because it will go into effect only after this summer. So that's still the digesting. And like you mentioned about the pandemic and the Wuhan, there are so many things that happen after the pandemic. When it comes to Wuhan, we definitely need to mention Yangtze Memory Technology, or YMTC, which is China's national hope to one day challenge Samsung and Kioxia in 3D NAND flash memory chips. At one point in early 2022, their tech is only about 2 generations behind market leaders. Apple also certifying their product for iPhones. Some say it might match the share of Micron by 2025. We also reported that it is putting its second plant into production. But now it faces a lot of hurdles to execute that plan because of massive export control from the US in place, while Japan and the Netherlands also follow this year. So it's getting very hard for them to buy tools from Applied Materials and Lam Research. Of course, YMTC will not give up, and actually now they are still hiring. And of course, they have stockpiled equipment and the parts. They are also very serious about trialing a domestic chip production equipment and already made some breakthrough starting a few years ago. However, it still cannot get the latest tool that all the market leaders are using. Also, another company we have to watch closely is Huawei, which has lived under the export control for several years. We have reported that Huawei is getting into chip production, chip packaging, with partners and invested in a lot of material companies, software company in the supply chain. Very recently, it even announced that its latest AI computing platform and say all the hardware are built by itself. And actually the performance they claim can match the mainstream GPUs out there. So it's still worth looking why Huawei has such a resilience, although it loses some of its competitive market share in smartphone, but why it's so resilient looking into the future. And then the latest remark recently at the Semicon China by YMTC's chairman, Cheng were very interesting. Actually, still, he said all the existing rules, harmony, and balance in the past are broken. Government intervention is the main theme right now. And the global industry will enter a time of disorder, he added, acknowledging the profound impact on the supply chain due to the US-China chip war. And that was completely different from 2017 when I was there at the same event. All the CEOs of top chip equipment makers by then, from Applied Materials, Lam Research, ASML to Tokyo Electron, travel to China in person. And by that time, they share like bright prospect and embrace collaboration. But the things have been totally changed since then.
Thank you. So how about Chris? It's also the question about the China. Actually, we have a lot of the questions from audience about the future and also the potential of the chip industry in China. So some questions ask like, how long will China need to be able to catch up with the West in advanced chip manufacturing? Or like how long will China need to become like a self-sufficient end-to-end advanced chip fabrication? But Chris, yeah, I remember in your book you wrote like, despite the rhetoric, yeah, China is not actually pursuing an all domestic supply chain. Yeah, they do something, but in that part probably use the outside technology or products. So when people are asking the future of the China's like a self-sufficient chip industry, how would you answer for these questions?
Well, I think there are a lot of people in the Chinese government who would like to become self-sufficient. But if you look at what Chinese industry is actually doing, there's not much evidence of a strategy of self-sufficiency except at the absolute leading edge where these export controls have been pretty binding. But it's still the case that China is the world's largest importer of semiconductors. That's not self-sufficiency if you're importing a very large number of chips. And it's also the case that China is a huge importer of semiconductor manufacturing equipment from many of the firms that were just mentioned. And so here too, there's evidence that China's strategy is actually not really to pursue self-sufficiency fully, but rather to buy a lot of equipment from foreign producers in an effort to build out capacity. Now, I think every Chinese firm would like the ability to have a complete domestic supply chain that they can turn to. But the reality is that no country has a complete domestic supply chain that they can turn to. And I think it'll be a very long time when we're talking about cutting edge production for China to have that type of capability domestically when it doesn't exist in any other country today.
How about, is there any like a specific area of the technology that's still missing or that people regard it quite difficult? Yeah, also there are questions about like advanced like tooling, the machinery, like lithography or those areas. Although China has its own companies, try to compete with the ASML, but how do you see those like a target or a level of the technology?
Well, right now, Chinese equipment firms across the board are quite far behind the cutting edge. They've got very small market shares and basically no market share at not just the cutting edge, but also 1 or 2 generations behind the cutting edge in most types of machinery. And so nobody knows how long it will take to replicate these tools. But the key question is not how long it will take to replicate these tools. It's where will the cutting edge be in the time that it takes to replicate these tools? And the dynamic that has made catch up in the chip industry so hard is that the cutting edge races forward at the rate dictated by Moore's law. And so if you catch up to the cutting edge this year, in 10 years' time, Well, that's 5 Moore's laws that have passed in the time you've tried to catch up, but you actually haven't caught up at all. And so that's what China has to try to undertake right now, not just catching up, but racing forward to catch up to an industry that's moving more rapidly than any industry in human history.
Yeah, maybe the now is the cutting edge, maybe the next cutting edge after 5 years or 10 years, yeah, even a few years. So it makes not easy, yeah, to catch up and to continue. Yeah, understand. But how about like as we suggested, so US and China, doing a lot of like countermeasures, but maybe also we think that like a recent move by the United States, not the last one. So if the US will take the next move after following this export control or like some Chips and Service Act, what kind of the areas will be the targeted, do you think? And what is a red line for China? Like, and what is our most dangerous card does China has as countermeasures if they feel that, oh, US doing that too much?
Well, I think right now we've primarily seen restrictions when it comes to leading edge chips, and the market for lagging edge chips has been much less impacted by either US restrictions or by Chinese countermeasures. But I do wonder how long that will remain the case. And I think if you look at the really vast expansion of production capacity coming online in China, especially in lagging edge chips over the next couple of years, this does seem to me to set the conditions for additional trade disputes when it comes to lagging edge chips. And there are people in the West who are already asking questions about whether China is trying to turn lagging edge chips into what it was able to do with solar panels, vastly expand production, sell at low prices on world markets, win market share, and threaten the profitability of foreign firms. And I think if it appears likely that Chinese firms are going to win substantially more market share at the lagging edge, I think we should expect the US, Japan, and Europe to respond by restricting access of Chinese chips into foreign markets. And that could have really profound ramifications because thus far we haven't really seen major disruption to lagging edge chips. And there's lots and lots of lagging edge chips that are sold into China and are exported from China. So disruption to that trade would be a significant escalation.
Yeah, probably the lagging edge chips related to like our expansion of the like a solar panel, like a power generation or those like eco stuff. But so now, yeah, Annie is just noting, yeah. Do you agree with the Chris, the estimate? How do you think if the US government will take the next move, what people are a bit worried about or what people are talking about? Do you have any idea on it?
Sorry, are you saying Annie or Lauly?
Oh, so how about Lauly? Yeah.
Yes, of course. I think I was just listening to Chris and I was just thinking about what countermeasures that does China has. And other than the raw materials, the recent raw materials like gallium and germanium, let's not forget that a couple of years ago, China also restricted the exports of rare earths to Japan. So it has a huge deposit of raw materials and rare earths that could not just impact Japan, but the entire supply chain. And other than the raw materials that China has, I was just thinking that so many foreign companies have big business in China, and that might be a little bit hard. Can be turned into a tool against the foreign companies as well. Let's take Micron for instance, and Micron aside, during the trade war escalations, we also read a lot of Chinese reports saying that, oh, today you're targeting our Huawei, tomorrow we can target Apple as well. So I think other than the raw materials aside, China has a lot of cards in its hands that can made the companies, maybe especially US companies, suffer, because everyone throughout the globalization for decades has so many manufacturing presence, supply chain deep rooted in China, and business for the huge 1.4 billion market there. So yeah, so listening to Chris, I was just thinking about all these countermeasures that may or may not happen. Nobody knows, because even for the gallium and germanium export control, the details are so vague. It's just a couple of lines. So people don't know how the Chinese government will actually execute those export controls.
Come back to China, like the same question or following up. So now, like Lauly mentioned, maybe the tightening up more of those like export of those raw materials. And again, I want to ask, but do you think what is the most dangerous card like that China has, or what is most dangerous card United States or other part of the world don't want to see that from China?
Of course, people sometimes will mention the most dangerous card could be the geopolitical tension between Taiwan and China. Actually, China never rule out the chance to take over Taiwan by force. So that's something that caught everybody's mind. But I've talked to a lot of tech industry executives. They all told me that because of the supply chain are so deep rooted actually in China and Taiwan. So actually that will cause massive consequences. So, but that is the most dangerous card I think China could have. It's to launch a blockage or even a potential war here between the Taiwan Strait and China. But that is very unlikely to happen. But still, they have this dangerous card.
How about Chris, about the most dangerous card that China has?
I think I agree with what's been said thus far. I think that the challenge that China faces is that, unlike the US, which has been able to impose restrictions on China with really pretty limited costs to US firms, the tools that China has are much less asymmetric and they hurt everyone, including China. So if China were to ban the export of rare earths, for example, it would cause massive implications across the supply chain, including for China. Same thing if it enforces the gallium and germanium restrictions in a strict sense, it'll hurt everyone. And I think that's been a factor that has limited China's willingness to retaliate at the same scale as the US has been imposing restrictions. I think when it comes to putting pressure on foreign firms in China as well, there's costs to China of doing that too. We've already seen foreign investment over the last year into China decline significantly. And if you impose costs on foreign firms, that will decline even more. And so that's the balance that I think Chinese policymakers are trying to strike. They want to hit back, but they want to hit back in a way that doesn't cost them too much. And the problem they face is that there aren't that many good options that satisfy both of those criteria.
Yeah, thank you all then. Yes, also, some questions from the audience. Yeah, this is about AI, of course. Chris mentioned like some big change since the book publication is, of course, the launch of the ChatGPT and the increasing interest of like a generative AI. So the question is, like, will artificial intelligence become the next focus of the chip war? So, Chris, how do you think?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it already is the focus of the chip war, both in terms of why countries are imposing these restrictions, but also in terms of where companies are focusing their energies right now. I think across the semiconductor supply chain, lots of companies were already focused on data centers as a growth market, but now the chips that go into data centers are even more important, as NVIDIA's rise for the past year has illustrated. And it's not just NVIDIA, it's TSMC, which produces for NVIDIA. It's all the packaging firms. It's a whole suite of startups trying to devise software and applications, taking advantage of these capabilities. So you've seen the entire industry begin somewhat to reorient itself around AI. And that's happened at a time when the industry's been looking for a new growth driver, because the past decade has been the decade of massive growth in semiconductors for smartphones, but that wave has slowed. that's no longer going to be a growth driver like it was 10 years ago. And so a lot of people in the industry are hoping that data center demand and AI applications will be the growth driver for the chip industry for the next decade.
Even there's a report like United States is considering to put some control on the cloud service to limit some like China's development in semiconductor or AI technology. But do you think that those US moves, by those moves, will China need to slow down their AI developments?
Well, it's difficult to say right now because in a lot of ways we're in the early stages of AI development. Right now, there's a desperate shortage of GPU chips globally. Everyone's trying to get their hands on that. And so right now, it's certainly the case that if you can control who gets access to GPUs, you can impact who's capable of training more advanced models. But it's not clear whether in 5 years' time, computing power will be the biggest challenge. And the fact that you have some big tech firms already open sourcing their models, so they do the training in-house and they release open source models, suggests that there are alternative paradigms of AI in which actually you don't need massive amounts of computing power if you can take an open source model and just tweak it for your own use case. And so we're going to have to see how the AI landscape develops to understand whether the types of controls that are being put in place will remain relevant when it comes to how AI is being deployed and used in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Actually, we need to conclude the webinar very soon, but we still have around 10 minutes. So I have the last questions for each of the panelists. So the first question is Annie. So we are talking about United States and China, and of course Taiwan. But besides those, but also there are other economies trying to develop on semiconductor industries, such as Japan, Singapore, and of course, like South Korea. So how would you say the roles of those countries?
Yes, I want to bring up that when I visit Europe top chip equipment maker ASML in the Netherlands earlier this year, this beautiful glass window at its Veldhoven headquarters that can oversee the whole area of clean room facilities and the green fields. On the window, they put this revenue breakdown by geography in 2022 that caught my eye. Asia is 87%, US 10%, Europe and others 3%. So you can see how important Asia is at the center of where the chip plants are as of currently. So let me give you a small breakdown. This Boston Consulting Group data of global chip production capacity. East Asia plus China has more than 70% of global chip capacity, with Taiwan and South Korea taking the lead of each 20% each. Japan is 17% and China is 16%. But actually semiconductor supply chain is long and complex. Even though Asia is leading in production, no one place has a complete ecosystem that can fully support the global electronics market. Taiwan only leads in logic chips, and South Korea is leading in all types of memories. And like we've said, that China also play a key role in mature node chips, as well as like raw materials. And looking forward, I think US and Japan probably will be the biggest two destinations that can hugely benefit from this supply chain rebalance, because they already have a lot of infrastructure of equipment, materials, chemicals in place, plus massive government incentive. And US especially, as it got all the best chip designs. For Singapore, it surely attracts all the foreign investors because it has less geopolitical uncertainty. But water and land could be a concern for them. And for Taiwan and South Korea, I think it's not likely for them to expand the current share, but they are both fighting very hard to maintain the lead. So for chip supply chain shifts, it needs lots of patience and good execution to make it successful. You see TSMC and Samsung and Intel all announced massive expansion plans in the US around 2020 to 2021, but those facilities will only be in production by late 2024 or even later. I remember clearly an executive at Germany's Merck, who is also a key chip supplier, once told me that they really would expect a more fundamental shift in maybe after 1 decade.
After 1 decade, okay. So it is quite a long time, the competition continue. So how about now, so we're talking about maybe the future of the semiconductor production nations, but also supply chain is extended to not only the semiconductor, but also other like players quite intensively and also geographically quite broad. And actually also today, we had a lot of questions from like Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and even from South Asia like India. So they want to know what happened to their countries' supply chain, especially those electronics industries. So the Lauly, do you think those countries can get benefit from the supply chain shift? So this is maybe the possible positive way, but also, or are we now seeing the next supply chain crisis? How do you think about that?
I wouldn't call it a supply chain crisis. Over the years of the trade war, Annie and we talked to a lot of industry people across the supply chain. And one thing is certain, the days when China is the only manufacturing powerhouse may be gone. And now this is a new era of regional manufacturing we are talking about. And yes, I think Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, India, each has their own strengths, are benefited from the trend. So today we are seeing a new notebook computer cluster forming in Vietnam and Thailand. And in Malaysia, which has an existing foundation for chip packaging and chip production equipment, is benefited from the semiconductor diversification trend too. Like for example, Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA, have been increased their presence in Southeast Asia after the October export controls last year. And other than that, we are also seeing Apple moving its production of iPhone, its revenue pillar, to India, which will make the South Asian subcontinent the biggest alternative iPhone production outside of China. And this is all already happening. And I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on India. India, like the US, Europe, Japan, it also wants to build its own semiconductor supply chain and has prepared a package of subsidy to support the program. And although recently we saw iPhone assembler Foxconn's chip project collaboration with India's Vedanta has ended, and some may say that it's a setback for India's ambition and Foxconn is withdrawing from India. But it seems that the ambition is still growing strong. And companies like Foxconn actually said that it remains really interested and committed to participating in India's ambition to build a chip development because there will be growing domestic demand for chip consumption there. And of course, there are challenges in the era of regional manufacturing, especially for the suppliers who built a complex and complete ecosystem in China for decades. China still has a lot of strengths and advantages for manufacturing, such as its skilled workers, the efficiency, and the infrastructure that are hard to be replaced of. So it is hard for the suppliers to step out their comfort zone. And there will be new cultural challenges, language barriers, talents, and rise of cost to overcome. So it's going to take time and to switch their mindsets to adapt into the new environment, the new era.
Yeah, thank you, Lauly. So this is a very last question. This is to Chris. So what kind of the industry landscape would you expect to see, let's say, after 5 years or 10 years? Yeah, there's one question from the audience. Our question is, do you see the bipolarization of the semiconductor manufacturing? That means a small group of the most advanced manufacturers and the rest with more traditional manufacturing technology. How do you see your view on the future of this industrial landscape?
Well, in some ways, that description is actually the status quo, where there's just a couple of countries that play the dominant role in the chip industry, and most of the rest of the world is insignificant. If you look at the production of advanced semiconductors, there's really just 5 countries in the world that are absolutely critical, and most of the rest of the world plays a small role. And I think that's not likely to change dramatically. I think we're certainly going to see the trends of a bit more bifurcation in supply chains that we've discussed, but the technology is so complex and the capacity is so capital intensive that it just seems to me implausible we're going to have a lot more companies, a lot more countries producing at the cutting edge. Maybe a couple more, but not many. And that complexity is not going to get less. It's actually going to get more complex over time. The supply chain will get more specialized over time. The demands for precision will increase with every single node. And that just increases the economies of scale that are necessary to produce efficiently. So I actually think that we're going to have just as much concentration in 10 years' time. The geography of that concentration might be somewhat different, but it's unlikely we're going to have a large number of producers at the cutting edge over the next 5, 10, or even a longer number of years.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, regrettably, we are running out of time and really have to conclude today's forum now. So summing up the discussion, discussion was very fruitful, but we still didn't see when and in what way this chip war ends. So we are going to continue to explore the status of the chip war. So currently we are planning to hold the next Untold Story of the Chip War webinar late September with Chris. So we will inform the detail to you when we are ready. So thank you for the participation. So please answer the survey after closing today's session. And it will really help us to prepare our next webinar better. And you are going to receive the Nikkei Asia newsletters, which list the important story, including those about ongoing chip war by Annie and Lauly. So again, thank you for your participation. So we are looking forward to seeing you at the next forum. Thank you so much and goodbye.